Hello. Today we're going to talk about the upcoming Basel III implementation. Not one of the more mainstream topics, but I did have some requests for this. And if you are a holder or investor in gold, this is something that the community has been discussing. So today on this video, we're going to talk about whether or not the implementation of the Basel III Accords will have an impact, in my opinion, on the price of gold. Welcome to the show. I'm Molly Elmore, and today we're going to talk about the Basel III Accords. These are some rules essentially that came from the banking industry after the 2009 banking crisis. They're primarily centered out of Europe, even though there's some perception that the 2009 financial crisis was kind of driven by US banks. There was a global response to that. And actually, I don't agree that it was simply a US banking thing. I'm just chiming in that I think that is a perception that some people have. So these rules were, at a big picture, at a high level, intended to encourage more responsible banking. Because what can happen is banks at a very fundamental level, you as a depositor, you deposit your money into a bank. The bank needs to make money. So the bank then lends your money out to make interest in various capacity. There's a lot of different ways that lending can happen. Some of those lending options are very low risk, like a sovereign bond, like a treasury note. Some of those options are much more high risk and can create problems if the place that your money is lent to loses the money, defaults on the loan that they make. Then you have this problem. So the intent here was to, at least in paper, to create a more responsible banking industry overall. And it was to address a couple of specific kind of problems in the industry. Now, there are multiple phases to these Basel Accords. I'm not going to cover all of them. The one that I'm specifically cherry picking today to talk about is how it relates to gold. So in the new sort of Basel framework, and this was actually released, I think, by the BIS last year, gold is now labeled a tier 1 asset. So when you are a bank and you kind of have assets on your balance sheet, they're not all sort of the same. So if you had real estate on your balance sheet or stocks or something, those are not considered tier 1. Tier 1 is generally assets that are as good as cash. What is amazing or surprising, depending on your position in the world, gold was labeled a tier 1 asset by the Basel III Accords, as announced, I think, last year. So this means that gold is now considered money by the banking industry, which, prior to the departure of the gold standard, decades ago, that was the case. But gold hasn't really been part of the monetary system for quite some time. And it isn't necessarily money in that people are buying things with gold or using gold as collateral on loans necessarily, but this is perceived to be a precursor to at least some banks globally re-monetizing gold. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about getting into a return to the gold standard and kind of how the end of the petrodollar sort of shifts into this. And I did a video yesterday about the petrodollar. And one thing I find remarkable when I read comments about it or look at threads on Twitter about this is that people will often cloud what they want to happen with what is the data is indicating will happen. So there are people who have very strong opinions, for example, that the petrodollar was not a good arrangement and therefore don't like it and therefore want it to end and therefore look for justification to support that hypothesis. Same thing with people who have been believers in gold. You can call them a gold bug. A gold bug who believes in gold will cherry pick things that lead them to believe the world is returning to a gold standard or lead them to believe that gold will be monetized. So what I'm intentionally trying to do here is put aside any of my personal opinions about the US dollar globally, about gold as a monetary asset, And I'm just trying to tell you what my interpretation is of the Basel III. Now, you're allowed to have your own opinion. Obviously, you can think whatever you want, but do be careful if you take on the role of analyst, which I'm doing here, of clouding your own personal opinion on something with what you are making kind of an estimation on what will happen. And so even though the BIS has renamed gold as a tier one asset, that doesn't necessarily mean the world is returning to a gold standard. So be careful of jumping too many steps ahead from what we actually know to be the case. Now, back in sort of history, at least the last couple of decades, the US central bank, the Fed, has supported in some capacity the suppression of the price of gold. And this, there's a good question about why and how this actually works. I did a separate video on how this actually happens, but we'll cover it briefly today. I'll put that other video in the description. The US central bank is heavily influenced by a couple of large commercial banks, including JP Morgan. And JP Morgan has participated in this system of manipulating the price of gold. This isn't something I've made up. Like, they actually were charged in court, and there's been court cases about it and plenty of articles written about it. And it is orchestrated using a system of naked shorts. And it has to do with this idea of allocated gold and unallocated gold. And this is one of the changes that is coming up in the Basel III Accords, if and when they're implemented. So allocated gold is when you physically have bars of gold, you own them in your possession, and they are sitting in a vault that you have access to. So it's when you think traditionally like, oh, I have a bunch of gold, that's what generally comes to mind, like that you literally have the gold. That is referred to as allocated gold. However, there's another way to theoretically own gold, which is through this process of unallocated gold. And this is similar to if I were to have gold and you wanted to borrow it so that you could maybe take out a loan and use the gold as collateral. But gold is really heavy, so you didn't really want to carry it. So what I did is I just made you a little piece of paper that said, you can borrow $1 million of Molly's gold. It's like a promissory note in essence, promising that you can borrow it, that you have access to this gold is like temporarily yours or whatever. And then you can use this certificate to go out and do what you want. It's kind of like back in the day when the US dollar was redeemable for gold. People used paper currency because it was easier to carry around and make change than actual bars of gold. So there was this idea that the paper was as good as gold, but the problem is that nobody was really keeping track of exactly how many bills were being issued relative to the amount of bars of gold that existed in the Treasury. So it got too tempting during the Vietnam War and Johnson's Great Society for the US government to maybe issue more of those paper notes than there actually were gold bars. Well, the same thing kind of goes on in this unallocated gold market, in that a bank could own, let's say they own 1,000 bars of gold, and they have like a little thing going on where they can rent out their gold, lend it out essentially to maybe a commercial bank that wants to be a gold trader or buy a bond or something with the gold. And they lend out this gold, but they don't want to lend out the physical gold because it's really heavy and it's a pain to move around. So they create this IOU, this paper gold certificate, and say, you know what, this is as good as gold. You can go do all your things, you're lending, you're investing, whatever, with this certificate that is redeemable in gold. Well, same thing kind of happened with the US government. Nobody was really keeping track of exactly how many of these unallocated certificates were being lent out. And it was widely believed that way more certificates were being issued than there were actual bars of gold. And this is how the market got manipulated. Was you could issue a whole ton of these certificates that would be used to short the market, drive down the gold price of gold if it got too high. And therefore, you didn't actually, it's a manipulated technique. Like, you're not supposed to do these things called naked shorts. They're actually illegal. But that is how the banks were keeping the price of gold down. Now, why would they want to do that? who benefits? Well, the US dollar has been the global reserve currency for a long time. And so if you are the issuer of this global reserve currency, which is the Fed, you have a vested interest in making sure your product is perceived highly in the market. And the biggest sort of threat in terms of the dollar, competitor, I guess, to the dollar, in terms of a store of value, like if you wanted to park your savings in something, one alternative to storing your money in dollars would be to store it in gold. And if people were monitoring the price of gold on a graph and it looked like gold kept getting more and more valuable, then many people would be like, maybe it's better if I take my savings and store it in gold versus storing it in dollars because it looks like gold continues to appreciate in value. And this might not be actually because gold is getting more valuable. It could very well be because the US dollar, because of inflation, is becoming less valuable. So it's just relatively speaking, gold is becoming more valuable relative to the dollar. Well, if you are the issuer of the dollar, that doesn't really serve you very well to have this competitor become increasingly perceived to be more valuable. So, what is an option? Is, well, let's manipulate that market to make sure that perception does not exist, that the gold is not perceived to be more valuable. Now, in the Basel III rules, if and when they are implemented, which is speculated to be in the US in January of 2023, there would be rules around this unallocated gold business, and that banks would have to keep this physical gold in inventory. They would not be allowed to lend gold out anymore. And it's rumored to put an end to this paper gold market, which is what's being used to manipulate it. So hypothetically, if the gold market were if they no longer had a mechanism to manipulate it and the gold price were allowed to go up, like that would in theory make the price of gold be higher, right? Sounds great. This kind of comes back to, if you watched any of my other videos about this larger war going on between the New York banks, the Fed, and the European banks, we call them Davos. There is a power play going on. It centers around control of the dollar and what we call the offshore dollar markets. And essentially, the Fed wants to regain control of the dollar globally. And there's a couple of problems that they are looking to solve. One of them is these banks outside of the US that are lending via fractional reserve lending and essentially increasing the dollar supply outside of the US banking system. Stablecoins are also a problem for them, which is why Jerome Powell has explicitly stated in the past that cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are not his concern. However, he does have an issue with stablecoins. And it's specifically because stablecoins are a mechanism to print new dollars outside of the US banking system. Now, this ongoing war between Davos and the Fed, it covers a lot of things, namely this Davos crowd. They like feudalism, which I'm not a fan of, generally because I will be one of the serfs, low on the totem pole. I don't want to be one of the people who owns nothing and is happy. And this European group, they happen to own a lot of gold. So they would love it if the New York banks could no longer manipulate the price of gold, because then their assets would be worth more and they could essentially use some different tools to monetize that, because their dystopian agenda is actually quite expensive and they need money to be able to implement it. Now, the New York banks don't really want this because, and this is debatable, this is again a hypothesis, a thesis that I happen to believe, kind of primarily driven by discussions in Tom Luongo's group, that the New York banks are not on board with the Great Reset. It doesn't serve them. They make a lot of money off the middle class. And if all of us were impoverished, how on earth would these commercial banks make any money? They also don't really want to give up their throne, which is they are kings of their turf. They own this sort of Wall Street market. Now, there are plenty of problems with the financial services industry. I don't know if that's debatable. However, for them to just cede their authority and become subservient to this sort of European oligarchy, it doesn't seem like they get anything out of it. And if they have to play along and go along, you would expect there to be some kind of incentive. So I'm still of the camp as of this date that the New York banks are not interested in being subservient to a European neocolonial oligarchy. that would end the middle class and dethrone the dollar completely. So they're putting up a good fight. This is why Jerome Powell continues to keep rates high, even though he's winning no friends anywhere. It's because the goal is to break these offshore dollar markets before the Great Reset dystopian agenda is implemented. Now, here's the problem that getting too excited about the Basel III Accords can cause you, is that if you are an investor in gold and you're really excited that the price of gold could go up when this is implemented, just know that they can't really make the New York banks do it, right? They could say you're not allowed to do this unallocated paper gold thing anymore, but the European banks don't control the New York banks. Like, I know we have this BIS structure and sort of central banks all report to each other, but the European Central Bank and the IMF have specifically told Jerome Powell to stop raising rates, and he is not stopping. He does not cede to their authority. So if the European banks tell JP Morgan, you now have to stop with this paper gold thing, so that you can't manipulate the price of gold, so that our gold becomes more valuable, then um, I don't know how they're going to enforce it. Now, there is another wild card in this situation, which is the Russian and Chinese gold markets. And there has been some speculation for some time that Russia plans to open its own exchange. China may as well. But let's say Russia owns its own gold exchange. And let's say hypothetically that they have free market, no price suppression. And I don't know what the price of gold is today, but it was around 1700 last time I checked. Let's say that in Russia, the price of gold is like $3,000, 3,400. Let's just say it's double. Well, this is where these arbitrage traders come into play. So let's say you're an arbitrage trader, which means you benefit from the fact that things are not always the same price in every place. What you could do hypothetically is you go to New York and or the London Bullion Association, and you buy a whole bunch of gold from the suppressed market. Let's say you buy a million units or a million, I guess, ounces at 1700, and then you somehow get your million ounces of gold over to Russia where you sell it for 3,400. Boom, profit. This is what arbitrage does. Now, this would cause a problem because that's a good deal, right? If you could sell it at one place and pretty much flip it for a much higher price at another place, it would essentially drain the West of gold, and it would move all of that gold over to Russia or the East. That would be a problem. So you would either not sell your gold at the suppressed price, or you would run out. Like it would create a challenge if the Russian market were to open and not be a suppressed price. And that may end up having a more significant impact. This again is my speculation on the price of gold than simply telling JP Morgan they're not allowed to do this paper gold thing anymore and them actually listening. So it is, there are a lot of indicators that gold is becoming a more valuable asset in the monetary system. Why label it a tier one asset if there was no intention to do that? It seems like people don't really do that kind of thing without some sort of agenda. We've also seen that the Russian currency is now using gold in a more significant way. China has been stockpiling gold. Lots of central banks around the world have been stockpiling gold. There are a lot of indicators that there will be a new use for it. Will we just go back to a gold-backed currency globally? That's a big deal, especially in certain places, like in the US. If we just decided to switch tomorrow, woke up tomorrow and all of a sudden like, hey, we got a new currency. It's now gold-backed. We've returned to the gold standard. People might think that's awesome, but if you own a home and that's one of your most valued assets, or you own a 401k, like that would probably lead to very serious deflation of those assets. Because let's say you own a $300,000 house. I did talk about this in another video recently. Let's say you own a $300,000 house and you want to sell it because you're retiring and you want that money to be liquid, available. Well, if nobody can get a mortgage anymore because now we're not doing credit and we just have this gold-backed currency, how are you going to sell your house? You're going to have to way lower the price so that somebody can afford to pay for it in cash. So while there are a lot of problems with our credit-based monetary system, to just dramatically switch to a new one, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage. The industries that currently thrive and survive on credit and cheap money are going to be hit dramatically. And there are a lot of people for whom their home is their most valued asset. So that is something to consider. And I would expect that this transition will be something that maybe happens a little bit more slowly. I know there is some belief that if we were to switch to a new monetary system, that it would kind of have to happen in a flip the switch moment. And I've sort of talked this out as well. And if the stock market and bond markets, for example, were to move to tokenized assets to be traded on the blockchain, I do think that would have to happen in one movement, because you can't really have two systems running at once. But in terms of whether or not gold will become a new form of money, I think there's signs we're going in that direction. It might essentially become, but it might not be the gold standard return that some people speculate on. I know that there's a big group of people who are believers in the Nasara Jassara movement. I do read about it. I think it's an interesting idea. I have so many questions about it that I have a very difficult time getting answers on. So short of that, I sometimes conclude that it's a little bit of a hopium idea. I'm not saying that it is not likely or possible. At this point, I still am looking into the logistics around that, because there are just so many loose ends that are unclear to me, namely who are the people who decide what you can spend your money on. Apparently there's some rules going around, and I'm generally a little curious about groups where you have this anonymous sort of savior types. There's been quite a few of those in the last couple of years. I think they're fun to read about. I'm a researcher. I read about all of them, I promise you. But whether or not I assign a high likelihood to any of those, no. Simply because if you get really convinced that one of those outcomes is going to happen, it can cloud your judgment and you can ignore flags. I see this a lot with Bitcoin maxis. I think Bitcoin's a neat idea. I'm fascinated with the story around Satoshi Nakamoto. I own some Bitcoin. Do I think Bitcoin is the future of money? No, because I have too many questions about it. And when I try to have these rational discussions about the pros and cons of Bitcoins with somebody who's a Bitcoin maxi, like they get almost mad if you try to talk about some of the downsides of it and the legitimate concerns I have around the cost of transactions and whether that would be feasible to do at scale. Sometimes they're so passionate about the thing they want to believe in that it makes them unable to have a objective discussion. Sometimes I see this with the Nasara crowd as well. They're like so convinced this is going to happen. And I saw this one indicator that supported my hypothesis, but they ignore the fact that there's so many things we don't know. And to implement something of that scale globally is such a massive project. I'd be impressed, actually, if it were implemented. Anyway, back to Basel III and gold. I do think we will see some changes as we move forward with the role of gold in the monetary system. I don't know if a lot of Western nations want to return to a gold standard because we're kind of hooked on this credit system. However, Russia and China, if they were to open their markets and sell gold at a free market price, in my opinion, that would probably have a bigger impact on the price of gold than the implementation of the Basel III, because I don't know how you're going to force some of these US commercial banks who have said they were not going to do paper shorts anymore. How are you going to actually force them to do it? I mean, what they're doing is illegal now anyway, but they do it anyway. So I don't know how the European banking system implementing some new rules is going to necessarily change that. So it's just my opinion on Basel III. I think we could, I'm going to watch it. We'll see. But I think there are some other things that will likely have a bigger impact on the gold value, the gold price, than this. All right. We'll see you in the next video.